The hopes were raised that limitation on personal autonomy seemed to be there in order to be removed. Internal limitations by psychoanalysis, external ones by social and political change. To write this account of my intellectual and professional travels through this landscape has been difficult because I have been uncomfortably forced to view that autonomy is not an absolute principle, even in psychoanalysis. Perhaps especially not in psychoanalysis. So, my request is, could you explain what do you mean that time and what do you think about it?
Well,
maybe the question of autonomy is ubiquitous and maybe interesting for the young people.
it's a big question, and I wrote a book about it. Can I say hello to you all, first of all? And I suppose apologise that this session has to be in English. I don't speak very much Polish, in fact, none at all. I speak psychoanalysis, you could say. You want to know what I think about autonomy and its relations with psychiatry and psychoanalysis. Well, it's one of the, as I say, how long have I got to explain all this? I was a young trainee psychiatrist in the middle of the 1960s. This is going to be a lesson in history for you, perhaps, but the 1960s were an important period in the development of Western culture. And I tried to understand from Vladek if it was at all present in the history of Polish culture. I gather it was not particularly strong. But at that time, young people thought that the world could be different, and that something about freedom, that people could have a life in which their own actions, feelings and behavior could be completely free. It was a naive view, but the important thing about it was that even if complete freedom and autonomy is not possible in a life in the modern world, at least maybe the 60s could say it can be better, we can have more freedom, we can have more autonomy. It was a political position, but it was very connected with psychiatry. It's quite extraordinary. Why on earth should a political movement towards autonomy have anything to do with psychiatry? But it did, and you may know of the work of an English psychiatrist called Lang, Ronnie Lang. Has anybody heard of Ronnie Lang, R.D. Lang?
Few of his books are translated.
Some people are nodding, yes. And he was connected with what was with a movement that was called anti-psychiatry. So anybody who had the slightest sort of anti-feeling about anything was in favour of anti-psychiatry. I worked in psychiatric wards and in what in England we call the large mental hospitals, which no longer exist now. One of the results of this movement in the 1960s was that all the large mental hospitals were closed down on the grounds that they created institutionalization, and that was bad. if you don't like institutionalization, therefore get rid of institutions. It's a very simple logic. Far too simple, as it turned out. But in those days I was thoughtful about the job of being a psychiatrist, where as much as anything your job was to encourage, support the nurses to ensure that patients had the drugs that would do them good, because psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses knew best for patients. It was a very reasonable sort of argument, because the people who came to psychiatric wards were the people who were not of easy disposition, and they'd caused so much trouble for friends, neighbours and relatives that they had to be somewhere. And these sorts of things stayed with me for a long time. Well, as you can tell, stayed with me until now. That feeling of doubt about what I was doing to people, which was for the best, except it wasn't for the best from their point of view. And it's really that sort of thing that's led to me eventually writing this book, 30 years afterwards, after that. I, at that time, in the 1960s, this sort of liberation movement which was around and in the West, in Western culture, was not only interested in what we called Western Marxism, a brand of Marxism rather different from Stalinist and the Soviet Marxism, which is, I guess, your background and your family's background. Western Marxism seemed to be much more benign. Came from the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer, came from Lukács, people you may or may not have heard of, doesn't matter. At the same time, there was an interest in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis as a radically different way of looking at human beings. At the time, standard psychology was based on behaviorism, that you cannot scientifically study a person's mind, you can only study their behavior. By the 60s, there was some revolt against that, towards well, I can go into that a bit if you're interested. But in the 60s, there was a view that psychoanalysis was a radical alternative to standard psychology, the psychology of behavior. Psychoanalysis seemed to be about the psychology of people's experience, what they felt and thought. It was the psychology of experience, and in particular, as you know, the psychology of those experiences which we have, which we don't know about, and which reside somewhere in some sort of mysterious space called the unconscious. And this sort of interested me as a young psychiatrist, in my naivety and my distaste for compulsory treatments of psychiatric patients. What was interesting at the time also was that there was a brand of psychoanalysis. You know, psychoanalysis has umpteen different brands on the psycho supermarket, and you can choose which you like. One of them derives from a woman called Melanie Klein. You'll see a picture of her up there, the the one towards the right, who had trained as a psychoanalyst just after the First World War, came to Britain in the early 1920s and thought she knew a lot about this unconscious that Freud kept talking about. She thought she knew more than Freud. She thought there were whole areas of the unconscious which Freud had not explored, and she decided she was going to explore them. She relied a lot on a psychoanalyst in Berlin, where she spent some time. She spent 5 or 6 years in Berlin, having her own analysis with a man called Karl Abraham. Has anybody heard of Karl Abraham? Oh, some people have. Fantastic. You are educated people. Well, and then she came to England in 1926 for reasons which are not important, but she developed the ideas of Karl Abraham, who had died in 1925, and thought that she was discovering a whole area of the unconscious which had not been properly discovered or discussed or employed in psychoanalytic therapy. She called it the deeper layers of the unconscious. She was always talking about the deeper layers of the unconscious, and she thought that these deeper layers were something that were particularly relevant to those people who suffer a psychotic condition, a psychotic breakdown. And she wrote a significant paper in 1946 and in the late 40s and throughout the 1950s. She and her co-workers were interested in doing what were in effect research psychoanalysis of schizophrenic patients. I was interested in this at the time because this was an alternative way of thinking about psychotic symptoms, psychotic experience. It wasn't about standard signs and symptoms that come from the descriptions by Kraepelin and Loyler. This was an attempt to understand schizophrenic experience, how schizophrenics try to cope with the world they live in, how they try to cope with their own background, their own history, and of course how they try to cope with being confronted by a psychoanalyst. This is how psychoanalysts work. They try to see how people cope with the experience, strange experience of being with a psychoanalyst. So there had been a lot of work done in London based on these ideas of Melanie Klein on the wall there, and so I took an interest in this as an alternative way of thinking about how we might approach people with suffering from a psychotic condition. Okay, so this was one of the developments out of war psychiatry and this explosion of interest in the 1960s in a different way of living after the Second World War. So there's a long answer to your short question. Anybody else got a short question?
Piotr Biernacki.
Dotyczy społeczności terapeutycznej. Pan wybrał psychiatra i jako entuzjasta społeczności terapeutycznej. Jak to, chciałem zapytać o to, jak to jest z taką wewnętrzną walką dotyczącą tego, że się jest psychiatrą i się wie, jak należy leczyć, a między tym, że trzeba oddać społeczności terapeutycznej, czy przywództwo, czy zgodzić się na to, że społeczność może wiedzieć lepiej?
So I'd like to know how you can deal with this internal conflict, being a psychiatrist on one side and being so enthusiastic about therapeutic community on the other side. It's a matter of the control. You're a psychiatrist, you want to control everything, and in the therapeutic community you have to let the community look for their own answers. I must say that Piotr works with therapeutic community in our work.
Yes, it's a conflict. There is a real conflict. And this comes back to what Vladek was hinting at the beginning about autonomy. And autonomy is a wonderful thing, but maybe complete autonomy isn't completely wonderful. There may be limits to autonomy, and I think one has to understand that in psychiatry. There are real problems in keeping some people's behaviour within acceptable limits. And of course you deal with that with drugs, with various verbal processes of coercion, with physical coercion. In the United States they still have physical restraints, don't they? They put people in bed and they literally tie them down.
So do we in Poland. So do we in Poland.
And you do in Poland, yes. So I think your point is right, that I'm old enough now to be able to keep my youthful enthusiasm in check a little bit. But I think there are real issues about some control of behaviour which can literally destroy the place, or even destroy other people, or patients who can literally destroy themselves. This is a reality about psychiatry. I think it would be a view which many people who worked in therapeutic communities would argue, and many people would say is completely wrong. But if you attempt to control people's behaviour by not just saying, don't do that, put down that knife, put it back in the kitchen, don't go around the wall or with it, or whatever. If you also said, come and work in the group that's going to be cooking lunch or something, if you say that as well as, no, don't do something, there is a response in many people who seem to be intractably difficult, that they will be able to engage to some degree or other in what might be thought of as more positive relations with other people, a more positive role within the community of the ward, or within the working groups within the community of the ward. The prospect of doing something for a community isn't completely unattractive to those people who are in a state of outrageous destructiveness towards everybody. Of course, some people have to be physically restrained, chemically restrained, and so on. But I think it is the big result that I would say comes from the therapeutic community movement, that if you have something really constructive going on in the ward for people to contribute I don't mean, oh, go to occupational therapy and play with the clay there. I mean, doing something useful for each other in the community. This does grab people in many, many cases. I hesitate to say the majority. I don't know why I hesitate to say the majority, but a significant number of people who appear to be beyond control. And linked with that is an extremely important idea that is held in a therapeutic community and should be held in mind by everybody who works within psychiatry. This is an idea which comes out of Melanie Klein's work. It was particularly addressed by Wilfrid Bion, who says that whether we like it or not, everybody has some aspect of themselves which is pretty mad, that deals with the world and deals with your own experience in a way which is unrealistic. It's out of touch, or largely out of touch, with the reality of the world and other people that one is in. In Bion's sort of catchphrase, there is a psychotic part to every personality as well as a non-psychotic part of every personality. And that applies to these wonderful authorities, psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses, that there's something in all of us that can behave with madness.
I have a question.
Yes.
But I want to tell you in Polish.
Yes.
Ja szkolę się w analizie grupowej i też pracuję z pacjentami psychotycznymi w takim myśleniu analitycznym, nie na oddziałach szpitalnych, tylko można długoterminowo z nimi pracuję. I jestem ciekawa, na co Pana zdaniem najbardziej trzeba zwrócić uwagę i o czym w takim myśleniu analitycznym w pracy grupy mam nie zapominać. Pana zdaniem.
Difficult question. I'm doing my training in group analysis, and I work with a group of psychotic patients in a long-term therapy, and I'd like to ask you, what is the most important, what is the thing I should ever have in my mind?
What do you think about this kind of work with patients?
Yes. I may not give you the answer you want to hear.
It's my risk.
It's what?
My risk.
Your risk it is. Well, I'll say two things. Make sure that they are intelligent, psychotic people. That is, people where the non-psychotic part of themselves has a lot of resources and can, in much more intellectual ways, think about their disturbance and can use the intellectual gifts to try to manage and understand what sends them mad. One of the problems with psychotic people, this is the second point, one of the problems with psychotic people is that they have a deficit in their symbol formation, and they have real difficulties, I mean particularly when they are in a psychotic crisis, in a psychotic episode, they have real difficulty in using and forming symbols. They use them very concretely. And therefore, if you have people like this who have difficulty with symbols in a group where what you use is words, then it's particularly difficult for them. So I'm saying, so these are the 2 points. Be aware that a form of therapy based on symbolism isn't for all psychotic patients. It may be for some psychotic patients who have an intellectual gift and can override this difficulty with a more intellectual use of symbols. Well, that's a personal point of view, and God, I've talked a lot. You must be dying to get away to your Sunday lunch.
Thank you very much, Robert, for sharing with us a lot of your interests, mostly in psychotic experience, in analytic, I would call it analytic angle on social psychology, and therapeutic community as well, which was maybe not long life, but a huge, big interest in your professional career.